Hi, good evening, everybody who's joining us tonight. My name is Sarah Kennel, and I'm the Donald and Marilyn Keough Family Curator of Photography at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. And I am really glad that you're joining us tonight. There's absolutely nothing going on right now, so what better to do than join us for tonight's program, which is part of our Conversations with Contemporary Artists series. Support for this series is generously provided by the Jane F. and Clayton F. Jackson Conversations with Contemporary Artists Endowment. This conversation is being hosted in conjunction with Dawoud Bey, an American project that has been co-organized by the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney Museum of American Art, New York, and opens at the High this Saturday. So please do come and see it. The exhibition is made possible by a lot of generous supporters, including our premier exhibition supporters, which is Delta Airlines Incorporated, and our exhibition series sponsors, Northside Hospital, the Antinori Foundation, Sarah and Jim Kennedy, Louise Sams and Jerome Keough, and the Wish Foundation. We're also supported tonight, the exhibition is supported by the Benefactor Exhibition Series supporters, including the Ann Cox Chamber Foundation and Robin and Hilton Howell. We also would like to thank the Ambassador Exhibition Series supporters and the contributing exhibition series supporters, and really all of you who are members, because membership is really key to sustaining the High, not only financially, but also morally. It really is our community that's so important to us. Your support is truly invaluable. It fuels our mission and all the work we do. If you're not yet a member of the High, or if you need to renew, please visit high.org at the end of this program. I am going to introduce our esteemed speaker in a minute, and we're going to have a conversation that, although it's slated to last an hour, we do have time for questions at the end. We will likely go over the hour, so please stay if you can. If you do have a question, please type it in the chat and we'll get to it at the end. So now it's time for me to welcome Dawoud Bey. Dawoud began his career as an artist in 1975 and has not stopped since then. I'm not going to read all of his biography because then we'll never get to the really good stuff. But let's just say that over the course of 45 years of photography, he really has transformed the practice of photography in the United States and around the world. In addition to his work as a photographer, he is a distinguished professor of photography at Columbia College in Chicago, and his role as a teacher and mentor is almost unparalleled. And I was just thinking, this morning that you could kind of throw a stone in the art world and it will hit somebody who has been impacted by Dawoud in one way or another. In addition, I'm not going to list all the honors and the residencies and the fellowships, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least note that Dawoud is a MacArthur Fellow Award, the Genius Award, in addition to receiving the Guggenheim and NEA fellowships. And most recently, in the New York Times Magazine, the 2020 Greats issue, he was recognized as one of 5 talents who have really changed their fields, but also the culture at large. So please join me in welcoming Dawoud Bey for this evening's exhibition. We'll have virtual applause for Dawoud.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm happy to be joining you and happy to be joining all of you who are joining us. Looking forward to this conversation, the first extended conversation you and I have had.
Yeah, actually, it's been a really interesting process of putting together this exhibition remotely and virtually, because of COVID. I was very fortunate to see the exhibition at SF MoMA where it originated. So of course, the result of the curatorial collaboration of Dawoud with Corey Keller at SF MoMA, curator of photography at SF MoMA, and Elizabeth Sherman, assistant curator at the Whitney. But of course, COVID kind of interrupted the flow of the exhibition. We're incredibly happy to have it here at the High for a number of reasons, and in part because, Dawoud, your work has been really integral to the High's collection. from the early 1990s. In 1996, the High Museum launched the inaugural Picturing the South Commission. This is an ongoing commissioning initiative that selects photographers really from around the United States and even outside of the United States to kind of cast a lens on the South, however they choose to define that. And in 1996, the first three photographers were Dawoud and Sally Mann and Todd Webb. So it's really great to welcome you back here some 24 years later with this magnificent retrospective exhibition. So I'm just gonna say there's a lot going on in the world right now, like this week, and while it may seem that an exhibition, talking about this exhibition seems apart from everything, I was reflecting today that this is an incredibly opportune time to show your work, and especially in a place like Atlanta. Because I think one of the enduring questions your work raises, and one that we're grappling with in different ways, is the question of how to center the Black experience in America, in the American cultural imaginary, a cultural imagination that so often erases or misrepresents Blackness. And I think that really gets me to the title of the exhibition, which is Dawoud Bey, an American Project. So I just wondered, before we get into your history, which I think is also deeply related to these tumultuous times and the kind of repetition of them over the last 50 years, I wonder if we could get your thoughts on this idea of your work as being part of an American project, an intervention or a dialogue with an American project.
Well, certainly, I think on a very fundamental level, whenever I look at my passport, it says that I'm very much a citizen of this place. And I think, secondly, I'm a citizen before I'm an artist. I think the notion of citizenship and how an artist can function as a citizen is also central to my work. And then, of course, the African-American experience in all of its multiplicity is central to the identity of this country. And we can get into it a little bit in terms of looking at some photographs, but I consider myself to be a part of a very long conversation about the way photographs are made here in America. I'm in a conversation with the history of photography as it has been practiced in this country. And then I'm bringing my own subjectivity, my own notion about the subject that I want to talk about, which have been primarily African-American subjects, through that history. But my work is definitely a part of the conversation about photography as a fine art, as it's practiced in this country.
So that is, I'm going to share my screen now again. That question about also, inserting yourself into and responding to a longer history of representation, and particularly photography, is a nice segue into your kind of the origin story, right? So I was wondering if you could share with our audiences maybe a little bit about, this is our little, said that, a little bit about the moment, the cultural moment in which you first became aware of the power of photography, and also really the role of museums in culture. And maybe speak a little bit about the importance of this exhibition.
Well, I think photography first really came onto my radar in a very conspicuous way in 1969 when I went to see this exhibition, Harlem on My Mind, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Before that, my relationship to photography was probably pretty much the same as everyone else's. Photographs were something that existed in books and magazines and newspapers, and that was the way we encountered them. But in 1969, which some of you, if you know your American history or if you were around at that moment, was a very contentious political moment in America. The Vietnam War was still raging, and people were speaking back to institutions in power of all kinds. And the museum got folded into that conversation. There were protests at various museums. I'm from New York. So for me, those protests centered on protests at various museums in New York around issues of access. Who would have access to the museum, whose images would be represented in the museum, who would author the experience that visitors would encounter in visiting the museum. And Harlem on My Mind proved to be very controversial for a number of those reasons. I was already very socially engaged as a teenager. So the controversy around Harlem on My Mind was spilled over into newspaper and talk radio at the time, caught my attention. And I wanted to go see, I wouldn't say I wanted to go see the exhibition. I think I wanted to go see the controversy because I was not going to the Met because I had a burning desire to see the photographs. That was entirely secondary. But on the day that I did go to the Met, and I was 16 years old at the time, there were no protests. Maybe they came after I left, maybe I got there and they had been there earlier, but there were no protesters in front of the Met the day I went. Which then let me decide to go in and see the exhibition. Ironically, of course, if there had been demonstrators in front of the Met, I'm not even sure I would have crossed the picket line. My political inclination was such that I probably wouldn't have crossed the picket line. I probably would have jumped on the picket line, talked to some folks, walked around, but there were no picket lines. So I ventured into the Met, which was the first time I had ever been to a museum on my own. The only time before that of visiting museums was with the usual class visits from school. We would go to see a Van Gogh exhibition or Rembrandt or some other European master artist, and then we would get herded back onto the school bus after passing through the gift shop. And that was the extent of my experience with museums. I didn't grow up going to museums. My family did not go to museums as a regular activity. And so I entered the museum and it was a momentarily overwhelming experience. You know, the Met is a grand space. I was absolutely intimidated, did not even have the presence of mind to simply walk up to the information desk and ask them where the Harlem on My Mind exhibition was. To my mind, everyone looked like they knew where they were going. So that's what I decided to do. I decided to pay my quarter or whatever because the Met at that time was pay what you want. And I decided I would start walking around and hopefully I would encounter this exhibition, which I did. And that proved to be a transformative moment for me. Seeing photographs of African Americans on the wall in a museum, including Van der Zee, James Van der Zee, who was one of the photographers whose work I remembered and continued to seek out after that visit. Just the experience of seeing photographs of ordinary African Americans on the wall of the museum, and probably equally seeing people walking around looking at these photographs. Because this is a whole new experience for me. These are not photographs in a magazine or a book or a newspaper. It wasn't a fine art exhibition, but I wouldn't have known the difference at that age anyway. It was just the fact that there were photographs on the wall of people who looked like me and my family and my neighbors, and people were walking around looking at them, giving them serious consideration. That's when the camera that I had gotten, my first camera from my godmother the year before, that's when the camera began to make sense to me. It wasn't an all of a sudden epiphany moment, but that's when it began to make sense for me. Partially because in addition to the controversy, uh, I had a deep family connection to Harlem. My mother and father, uh, who you see in the picture on the right in 1947 on 151st Street, they met in Harlem and lived in Harlem. And my aunt, who you see in the other picture with my mom, they lived in Harlem. So I had a very deep personal connection to the community as well. So that experience of going to the Met and seeing that exhibition and the experience of my own family's history in Harlem led me to decide that the first project that I would pursue would be to go back to this community that I had a connection to, but had never lived in, and begin to reconnect to that neighborhood through making photographs there. You can back up. Let me talk about those pictures too, because it's important. Because after the Harlem on my mind experience, I started actively seeking out photographs. And one of the first photographers I encountered was Roy de Carava. I found a copy of this book, The Sweet Fly Paper of Life. The Roy de Carava was someone who very early on became important to me. And then I started just looking for exhibitions. Fortunately, my dad used to buy the Sunday Times, and in the art section of the Sunday Times every week, there were exhibition listings. And all the way down at the bottom of those listings, it said photography, because photography was not yet integrated into the larger art conversation. So I would look in the paper for photography exhibitions, and that's how I found myself at the Marlborough Gallery, looking at Irving Penn's exhibition of small trades. These are ordinary people that Penn brought into the studio in their everyday work with their guys. So I went to Marlborough Gallery on 57th Street, an absolutely intimidating experience. You know, being a young Black teenager, walking into Marlborough Gallery. And of course, nobody said, hello, how are you, welcome. If there's anything you need to know, we'll be here. It was a very intimidating experience, but I was determined to see these photographs. Because what I was looking for, it was trying to begin my own process of self-education, looking at photographs, trying to get a sense of those photographs that have been made that might have something to do with what I might want to make in terms of my own work. And that's how I encountered Mike Disfarmer's work in a small exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art around the same time. And then another trip back to Marlborough around that same time, where I encountered Richard Avedon's photograph. And so something about, and I was looking at a lot of other photographs too. I went to see the Harry Callahan show at the Met. But these were the exhibitions that began to resonate for me. This idea that ordinary people sitting or standing in front of the camera and presenting themselves to the camera, that could result in something both visually interesting and resonant, that would be enough to hold one's attention, was what led me to begin my own work photographing in Harlem and beginning what became Harlem, USA.
Could you tell us a little bit about this picture, which I think you consider sort of your first successful picture, and how you went about engaging with your subjects? Because it's intimidating to start out as a photographer and ask people to pose for you. So could you tell us a little bit about this work in particular, and then how you moved through Harlem, and sort of what your intentions were throughout the series?
Yeah, well, this is a very important picture for me because, as you know, it is the photograph that I think was the first photograph that I made that rose to the level of the ambition that I had set for myself. The first photograph that I made, when I looked at it, I kind of felt like what I felt like when I looked at this farmer's work, or when I looked at Penn's work. It was like the first time I felt that in my work, that I had actually made something that rose to my own level of aspiration. It was also very significant because up to this point, I was thinking in terms of this project, which I don't know that I had even thought of fully as a project when I started, as a project of making photographs of Harlem that would stand in opposition to the more pathological representations of African Americans in popular culture. But what I found out in making this photograph, that it was as much negotiating a social situation as it was a picture making challenge. Because one Sunday morning, I saw this man, but he wasn't standing alone. He's standing alone in the photograph, but he was actually talking to, I think it was 2 or 3 other older men. And mind you, I'm very young at the time I'm making this photograph. And I look ahead and I see him, and I know I wanted to photograph him. I wasn't at all interested in photographing the other 3 men. And it immediately started to feel like a challenge, that there was a lot more engaged in making the kinds of pictures that I wanted to make, that the pictures were not going to just happen, that I was going to have to somehow integrate myself into the social situation, make introductions, and kind of figure that piece out. So when I first approached the group of men, I lost my nerve. I didn't exactly know what to say. And I just said good morning to all of them and kept walking. And I got to the end of the block. And that was the first important conversation I had with myself. Because basically what I told myself, if in fact you want to be what you are saying you want to be, you're gonna have to figure this out. So I turned around and walked back, trying to figure out what I was going to say, because I had already passed by one time, thinking they might think it was a little strange that I was passing by again, and trying to quiet my nervousness as I approached them. And then I just fixed my gaze on this one man, and probably said something to the effect that I really noticed you as I went by before. Do you mind if I make a picture of you? The other 3 kind of faded away. They backed up. And then he said, what do you want me to do? I'm like, oh man, now I have another challenge. What do I want him to do? I want him to do what he was doing before I interrupted him. So this is when I really began to think about the process of, as I always refer to it, as making photographs. Not taking anything, you have to make the photograph. You have to, you know, figure this thing out and make something with the subject. So I basically told him to, why don't you relax and do what, you know, what you were doing before I approached you, and just look into the camera. I was still working with a very small 35mm camera at the time, but I was making the pictures very deliberately, probably because I had been looking at a lot of photographs that had been made with a big camera mounted on a tripod, and I wanted to make those kinds of cameras, those kinds of pictures, even though I was using a very different kind of camera. So I only made 2 exposures of them. I made this one and a vertical one. And then I thanked him. And then when I got back and processed the film, made the contact sheets, and made the print, it was a very necessary moment of affirmation for me that I could, in fact, do the thing that I had set out to do. So this is it's a very important photograph for me. I call it my first successful photograph.
One of the things that stands out for me in this picture, and I think the next one we have up, also is the attention that you're paying in Harlem, both to a kind of older generation who might have been the youth in the Vandersea period. They might have been the elegant youth, and the sort of the way they present themselves and dress, and the incredible kind of fashion and care. So, and I'm wondering, when you're making these, are you also thinking about, you know, your kind of your parents and your grandparents' generation in Harlem, and this continuous tradition of the Harlem Renaissance? You know, because I see a lot of these photographs, you know, as almost an homage to the generation that's raised you, and that has also kind of raised a whole generation of Black Americans.
Yeah, but I think I was acutely aware that I wanted to make certain kinds of photographs that spoke to Harlem's history in a way that was directly related to the kinds of pictures that I had been looking at. Like that picture of the man in the bowler could have been 1920, 1930, could have been Vandersea, it could have been Walker Evans, it could have been any of those photographers. But that's what I was referring to, you know, when I say it's a conversation with the things that I'm looking at, as much as it's a conversation with the people that I'm making photographs of, and a larger conversation about trying to make a certain kind of representation of African Americans. Certainly, you know, fashion and the way Black people present themselves out in public. Part of it is also a memory of something that my father used to say all the time. My father used to say, back in the day, a man would not even go out the door without a hat on his head.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom was like, a woman wasn't dressed if she didn't have a hat, you know? So these things stayed with me. So when I encountered women with a hat, or I encountered a man with a bowler, it's that moment, but it's a moment that's also tied to a lot of other moments, and tied to my own memories as well.
I love this picture as well. I was thinking a lot about your early experience of seeing the Penn show, your Irving Penn show, Small Trades. And, you know, you make a lot of pictures about labor and pride. But also this seems to speak to me about something about your portraiture, which is really looking at the negotiation between a person's individuality, their interiority, and their environment, in this case their work environment. But it is this kind of dialogue that is a through line through a lot of your work. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, you know, the trades pictures that you make that are part of Harlem, USA, but really are, you know, there's the shoemaker and there's the barber and there's sort of others who define themselves by their work.
Well, I've always been as interested in the space that people inhabit as much as I am the individuals themselves, because the the space in which they're situated in is a large part of the narrative of the photograph. You know, so it's all important. It's this man, this Black man, standing proudly in his business, in his barber shop, with this wonderful, you know, spray paint decor, you know, this beautiful sense of improvised interior style. And he's presenting himself proudly both to me, to the camera, and to the world in an almost iconic kind of way. So the space that the subjects inhabited, uh, in terms of what the space is said about the individual and how the space had the capacity to, in some way, amplify our sense of the individual, was important to me.
I think that's where too, your goal to kind of resist a photographic narrative in which Black Americans are conditioned by their environment, right? In the sociological or documentary tradition, that the environment, you know, really shapes the individual. What you're showing us here is the other way around. And I think that's a really important aspect of your work. I also, before we move on to the next series, I wanted to talk a little bit too about your interests in youth and children. This is one of my favorite pictures in the show. It's not exactly the same kind of portrait dynamic that we've seen in the other pictures. It's almost like, I think of that great Rodin sculptural, The Burghers of Calais, where there's all the figures and they're all moving. It's just got this wonderful dynamic energy. But I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about, you know, also in addition to photographing maybe the elders in the community, you spent a lot of time really looking at children.
Well, I certainly wanted to be as broadly representative of the population of the community as possible, in terms of men, women, older men, younger men, young people, just to try to give a vivid sense of the population of Harlem at this particular moment in the 1970s. This picture is a very different kind of picture than most of the others. Most of the others are formal portraits in which the subjects are directly engaging with me. The photograph of the four kids is very much a Gary Winogrand kind of photograph. I started looking at Winogrand and Cartier-Bresson and, you know, making these kinds of moments of photographs that are kind of spontaneous choreography. You know, so it's always an idea about certain kinds of picture making as much as it's an idea about the subject. So this is a very different kind of improvisational photograph. I actually never engaged with or interacted with these four kids at all who are waiting for the bus. And I think they're all looking for their bus passes because now the bus is coming. And I'm just trying to, you know, insert myself into the ongoing choreography of this moment. But it's a very different kind of photograph.
Yeah, it's very different, for example, than, you know, the famous boys in front of the low seater. We had a great talk, Dawoud and I, the other day, trying to figure out whether the shadow, or whether the figure in the ticket booth was a figure or a shadow. I wanted to see it as a kind of Dawoud's version of an J, you know, the photographer reflected in the window. But I think the mystery remains open.
You talked about this a few days ago. I think it's a shadow. That's based on how, you know, the angle that the picture's made from. I'm kind of directly in front of him. So I've always thought that that was the person in the ticket booth. I didn't really start to even think about it more deeply than that until you mentioned it. But yeah, you know, in this photograph, which is probably the most well-known photograph in this particular Project, I saw this young man coming. He was the epitome of cool. I knew I wanted to make a photograph of him. I was standing in front of the movie theater, which seemed like the perfect backdrop, the way, the lights behind him are almost like horns blaring behind him. Feels to me like there's an orchestra blasting behind this kid. And he was just so cool. I won't go into the story in any detail, but I always hoped that I would encounter him. At some point, I always wondered what had happened to this young boy. And I finally found out a few months ago. Somebody posted the picture on social media, and his niece responded that that's my Uncle Damon. And so I got in touch with that person. And I've since been in touch with the family, sent his sister a copy of the book with him on the cover, sent her a small print. And it turns out that Damon, unfortunately, passed away when he was 29 years old from leukemia. But I always hoped or imagined that I might be, because of the ubiquity of this photograph, I had hoped that I might be reunited with him at some point. But
yeah, it's too bad he's not around to see it now. I want to touch, I think we're running out of time, so I'll pass over the last picture. I wanted to touch briefly on something you said when we were talking about the 4 children and that how that was a much more kind of picture built on spontaneity and contingency and really in the tradition of street photography, because this is kind of what you start to do with the next kind of engaged period in your work and in the exhibition, really exploring the capacity of the 35mm camera and wide angle lens to respond intuitively to what you see. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about what this period meant to you and how you were trying to work through.
After I completed the photograph in Harlem and had an exhibition of them at the Studio Museum in Harlem. If you go back real quick, because most people,
there we are.
But this is the location of the original Studio Museum in Harlem. You can see the name on the door, 2033 Fifth Avenue. Fifth Avenue right off of 125th Street. On the second floor. Pretty much that whole second floor was the museum, and then on the corner top floor was the artist in residence space. But this is where I presented Harlem, USA for the first time when I completed the work. It was important to me that I show that work in the community in which it had been made, which was one of the controversies around Harlem, USA, that they were photographs of Harlem that the people in Harlem did not have direct access to, which informed my decision to want to make sure when I completed that work, that the work was shown in the community in which it had been made, which pretty much became a model for my work going forward for several decades. But after I completed this work, I returned to this idea of working with the small camera in a more improvisational way. And I spent a month in Syracuse, New York, which is where these photographs are made. And it's basically about trying to just find moments of sort of spontaneous, activity that one can shape into something that is a resonant photograph. This is more of a traditional portrait, the girl inside, but then you have that woman outside who stops momentarily. So I began working, I guess you could say, with the small camera in a way that was more consistent with what that camera was made to do. The introduction of the Leica and the Impetus and the 35mm camera was all about being able to make pictures in a way that was inconspicuous, that one did not have to, be immediately engaged with the subject, but there could be a certain kind of presence, non-presence. And so I start mixing up these different vocabularies. Some of them are spontaneous, some are somewhat spontaneous, and the other is the person engaging with me. So I'm mixing up these different kinds of photographs and using the African American subject as the narrative constant while I begin to explore other ways of making pictures.
I think one of the things that stands out for me in these photographs, a lot of the street photography that, sort of emerged in the 60s, 70s, 80s, or think about Rena Grand or Friedlander or Frank, that the beauty and the compelling aspect of them is often the unexpected conjunctions, right? That the photographer seizes and captures, but
Yeah.
very often it comes at the expense of the subject, so sort of unaware, right? And one thing that really distinguishes a lot of your street photography is that you still maintain very often there's this gaze, right? She's got it, the young boy has it, and that seems to me that's really important to you, even within a body of work that is built on the notion of contingency. And I wonder how that impacted your thinking really about when you start working with the next body of work, which is what you also call street portraits, but not street photographs, or the Type 55 work.
Well, after several years of working with the small camera, making pictures in which the people that I was photographing were not entirely active participants in the making of the pictures. They are, because they're in my photographs, so they're very much a part of the work. And they did, in fact, allow me to make the photograph, but they were not, I started to have problems, ethical problems with this notion of making photographs of people in which the subjects themselves, never got to see the way I was constructing this representation of them in the world, which I was able to do in Harlem. In some cases, like the barber was always going to be there. So I could go back and give him a print. The man in the luncheonette, he's going to be there. But most of the other people in the street, even though I carried around a bunch of 8x10s in my camera bag, I never saw them again. And at some point, it became important to me that the people that I was photographing be in possession of the image that I was making of them. And that's when I stopped using the 35mm camera, taught myself how to use a 4x5. I got a secondhand 4x5 camera and a tripod. And along with that, in order to be able to give the subject something at the moment the photograph was made, I started using Polaroid Type 55 film, which made an instant print and an instant reusable negative from which I could later make exhibition prints. And because of the large negative, I was able to also make larger prints, which was about giving the Black subjects in the work an even more resonant, expansive presence in the space in which I was showing these photographs. I wanted to give them that much more of a presence.
Yeah, we should note that for this or more recently, you've printed these at, I think, really over life size. You've printed them at different sizes over the years, and they have a really, the word I use is monumental presence.
Yeah. When I first started printing, the largest print that one could make in a conventional dark room was 20x24, which was certainly bigger than the 6x9 prints that I've been making in Harlem. But it was about creating a more monumental presence for the Black subject through my work. Now they're printed 40x30, and depending on the proximity of the subject to the camera, some of them are in fact larger than life size. Because I've always, my work has always been made for the space of exhibition, either galleries or museums. So I've always been acutely aware of where the work is going to end up and what I want to bring into the conversation that take place in those spaces, who I want to claim space for within the space of the museum. And I'm basically claiming space for myself as an artist, but I'm also claiming space on behalf of the people that I make photographs of, to bring them into the museum, to give them the same prominence that, you know, anything else in the museum has.
You said at one point that you're like a white cube artist who makes non-white cube art, right? That you sort of participate within this ecosphere of.
Yeah, I'm a white cube artist that makes work about non-white cube things.
Yeah.
My work exists very much, and I want my work to exist as part of the conversation that takes place in those kinds of spaces. Whose images can inhabit those spaces? Whose work can be part of the conversation around what constitutes contemporary American art practice?
So I wanted to ask in relation to that as well, you know, when you start working with the Polaroid 20x24 camera, which of course is a huge camera, and it's a very different process. You work inside the studio. Your thoughts in making these portraits, which are now, you know, we're showing the multi-panel ones, about also your role within the larger history of art, not just the kind of history of photography, but there's resonances that you've spoken about and written about here to Rembrandt, for example. And what I love about these Polaroid multi-panel portraits is that they really combine both that sense of monumentality and maybe a kind of attaching yourself to a longer tradition of psychological portraiture, you know, with Rembrandt or Caravaggio, but also, you know, with the multiple panels too, there's a sense of contingency of the individual, him or herself, you know, not being captured in a single image. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about making these and making them in the studio, and a little bit about, you know, your thoughts about how you evolved into these multi-panel works. So I'll go back to Anika. She's one of my favorites.
Yeah, when my making work in the 20x24 Polaroid studio came directly out of those years that I spent making work with Polaroid Type 55 film, because that work was made with the support of what had been Polaroid Artist Support Program, in which Polaroid made material available to artists in return for some of the work made with their materials entering into the Polaroid collection. And that's basically how I was able to continue making that work for several years. And that established my work, my relationship with Polaroid. At some point, after having been making work in the streets for a long time, I wanted to find other ways to make work. And I started thinking about, excuse me, I had to write a book report, or a report on Rembrandt when I was in the 6th grade. I don't remember how I chose Rembrandt as the subject of this report in the 6th grade. I clearly must have been in a very good public school at that time to be in grade school writing a report about Rembrandt. But something, I was really taken with his work. I never forgot it. And even from an early age, he kind of became one of my favorite artists. You know, the heightened sense of presence of the individual in Rembrandt's paintings was something that stayed with me. And so when I began making work in the 20 by 24 studio, and which I wanted to, there were multiple agendas going on here, one of which was to focus more resolutely on the subject and take them out of the sociology of the environment and to just concentrate more resolutely on the subject. And so I started by making these single image portraits that were very much informed by Rembrandt's work, single light short, deep brown background. Most of Rembrandt's portraits have this wonderful kind of isolated brown space, and there's a single light short. And there is this elevated sense of the individual in his work. And so that became the starting point for my studio work. As well as you mentioned Caravaggio and the lighting, how to use lighting to dramatic effect, how to use lighting to heighten the drama of the subject. So Rembrandt and Caravaggio were the starting points for this work, but primarily Rembrandt. Whenever the photograph didn't have enough drama, I would always say to myself, it needs more Caravaggio. That's one of my expressions. It needs more Caravaggio. So I started with the single image portraits. And as I was pinning them up in the Pollywood studio to see the results of each portrait, I decided that I found something interesting about the way the photographs look together, as opposed to making a choice about, you make a certain number of photographs and then you choose the one and then the others just kind of disappear, I guess, which is a conventional way of working as a photographer. You make 36 exposures on a roll of film or however many, and then you choose the one that's the best one, and the rest of them, unless you live long enough for somebody to publish a book, in which we suddenly begin to see, as with Cartier-Bresson, that there was no one decisive moment. It was a way of breaking that way of working and thinking about making the work. And then I decided I wanted to keep, it's hard to tell looking at them on the screen, but they are they have a very rich materiality to them, in which we're able to see more in the photograph than we could even see with our eyes. So I decided I wanted to amplify the physical presence of the subject by moving closer to them. And once you start moving closer, you're leaving something out, and then you have to put that something back in. And that's how I began to construct these multiple image portraits.
I wonder if you could, this thinking.
And I wanted to keep it centered in this case on young people.
Yeah.
I wanted to work out my ideas about picture making with young people as the subject, because young people are just left out of a lot of conversations. So I want to bring them back into the conversation through my work, which of course leads to class pictures.
Yeah, so this is a series that I think is, you've written a lot about your mission to kind of endow your subjects with interiority in different ways, whether it's kind of paying attention to their material presence, whether it's a reciprocal exchange. But in this series of work, which you made beginning at the Smart Museum of Chicago, but have done, really as part of ongoing teaching residencies, you're teaching with your students, and then when you make their portraits, you're including their own words. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that switch to, just the photograph, to the photograph, with the text. And I think what's so striking to me too is how powerful the self-presentation and self-identity, of some of the students are. Because being a teenager, this is a kind of a critical moment of identity formation right? Where you're negotiating the pressures from outside and defining who you are. And not too many photographers, really capture that with teenagers in particular. So what was your experience like, working with the students, and was it hard to get them to, to draw them out?
Well, this project, Class Pictures, in which I made photographs working with high school students in New York, San Francisco, and points in between, was first of all about making a kind of, not in the literal sense, but an historical snapshot that would represent America at this particular moment through its young people. And it was also a response to the fact that there are more things the photographs don't tell us than what they do. And I don't know that we think about it that way looking at photographs, because we try to load them up with as much formal and material, and if it's a portrait, psychological content. But there's always more about the subjects that we don't know. We don't know if they have siblings. There's a whole lot that we don't know. And for this project, I wanted to bring that information outside of the frame of the picture into the construct of the work. I didn't want it to be just my representation of them to my photograph, but I wanted their voices, their self-representation, to be a part of the construct of the work as well. This particular project to me demanded that, the information the photographs don't contain. I wanted to bring that. There's no way you could know what Kevin tells you in this text.
Right.
I'm looking at.
Well, I think of teenagers too as often trying to project an identity that they don't necessarily have yet, right? They're in a moment of flux, so you can kind of even see these aporia, these gaps between the way they present themselves, but then also maybe what they write, which can be incredibly heartbreaking. I think, so far we've shown a lot of your really powerful work in portraiture, but the next project, which may on the face of it look like an ongoing portraiture project, really is the first time that you're more explicitly addressing history and American history. I mean, I think it is embedded in so many of your pictures, the individuals' sort of negotiation with community and place and history. But I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the Birmingham Project, in which which was made sort of in anticipation of the 50th anniversary of the 1963 church bombing in Birmingham, 16th Street Baptist Church, but also how that intersected with your own personal history and kind of brought you back to a moment, of identity formation as a child.
Well, it's interesting because the Birmingham Project is the first time in which I very consciously begin to engage specific history. In this case, that moment, September 15th, 1963, when 4 girls were killed in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church, and 4 boys, 2 boys rather, 4 girls were killed in the dynamiting of the church, and 2 boys, 2 African-American boys, were killed in the violence that ensued after that. And I wanted to make work about this. There was, when I was, let me see, the book came out. This book, The Movement, which was published in 1964. My mother and father went to hear James Baldwin speak at the church that I grew up in. And after Baldwin spoke at the reception afterwards, they were selling this book called The Movement, which was a book of photographs of and about the civil rights movement that had been published by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as a fundraising vehicle. And Baldwin may very well have been on a speaking tour for this book. I don't know. But my folks brought this book home, and they didn't tell me, here, you have to look at this, because if they did, I probably wouldn't have looked at it, or probably would have really taken my time. When you're 11 years old and your parents tell you, you have to look at something, the last thing you're going to do is look at it, or you're going to try to find your way to it on your own. But when I finally started looking through the book, there were a number of violent, horrific photographs in this book, including lynching photographs and other photographs about the horror of being Black and living in the South. And among those pictures is this picture by Frank Dandridge of Sarah Jean Collins, who was the sister of Addie Mae Collins, who was one of the 4 girls who was killed in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church. She was a little bit further away from the wall that the dynamite was planted on the other side of, so she didn't get the full force of the blast, but she was, as you can see in this picture, severely wounded. She did lose one eye and partial vision in the other. And I saw this photograph in the book, The Movement, and it just literally shook me. And I don't know that I intuited at that time that one of the reasons that might have shaken me so deeply was that I was pretty much the same age as the girl in the photograph. And that book was pretty much pictures of all the things that my parents had done their best to protect me from up to that moment. So that photograph just seared itself into my psyche. And then at some point, I parked it somewhere. You know, you move things around and you just, something happened, I would say more than 40 years later, something like 50 years later, maybe 45 years later. I would have to look at my emails to know exactly when, but something shook that picture loose. And one morning, lying in bed, it came flashing back. And with such a force, you know, I had heard the expression before, to sit bolt upright. And to me, it was just an interesting expression, to sit bolt upright. But I literally, this picture came flashing back, and I sat bolt upright in bed as if somebody had smacked me on the back of the head. And what came back was that photograph of Sarah Jean Collins lying in the hospital bed. And so I knew I needed to go to Birmingham and make some work. But first I needed to go to Birmingham and see and bear witness to the place where this had happened. And so I didn't know anyone in Birmingham at that point. I just scheduled a visit to Birmingham, probably on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or maybe it was Saturday, Sunday, come back Monday, I don't remember. But specifically on a weekend so that I could be there to attend the church service at 16th Street Baptist Church. I wanted to be in the church where this had happened. And that's where the project begins. The Birmingham Project begins with that photograph of Sarah Jean Collins lying in a hospital bed. And my first trip to Birmingham and meeting the minister at 16th Street Baptist Church gave me a sense of just how complex and in some ways contradictory the history of that moment is. It made me quickly aware of the fact that there's mythic history and then there's the messy actual history. They're related, they're not the same. I was trying to figure out what could I do? How does one make work in response to that horrific moment? I started doing research at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. I didn't want to just show up and start making photographs. And I don't know what I would have photographed anyway. How many pictures could I take of 16th Street Baptist Church? And then I started to meet people, in the community. People started to give me suggestions. Why don't you photograph some of the former but still surviving? They call them foot soldiers of the civil rights movement. And that didn't seem to be the response that I wanted to make. While doing research at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute was when I first found out that in addition to the 4 girls, 2 boys had been killed that day as well. And so I knew that whatever I did would have to embrace those 2 boys. So eventually, once I started to think about what I could do, and then I got in touch with the Birmingham Museum of Art. I was introduced to the Birmingham Museum of Art by someone, Jim Sokol, who became a very good friend, who ended up really kind of guiding me into this project. I decided that what I would do would be to make photographs of young African Americans in Birmingham now who were the same ages that those 6 young people who had been killed in Birmingham were. The girls were 11 and 14, and the 2 boys who were killed in separate incidents of racist violence after the bombing of the church were 13 and 16. So with the support of the Birmingham Museum of Art, I started reaching out into the community, basically looking for subjects who were the same ages as these young people. I wanted to give them a less mythic presence and a more palpable presence through these young people. And that still left the work feeling kind of incomplete, because I wanted to find a way to talk about the passage of time, the possibilities that were lost at the moment that those young people were killed. And that's when I decided to also make portraits of African Americans in Birmingham who were the ages that these young people would have been had they not been killed. And that was 50 years later. So the young person would be 13 and the adult would be 63. I made them separately in 2 different locations. Some of the pictures were made in the Birmingham Museum of Art, which at the time of the civil rights movement, like all public institutions in Birmingham, was a segregated space. And the other photographs were made at Bethel Baptist Church, the church that was pastored by the activist minister, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. So I wanted to bring those 2 pieces of Birmingham's social history, to wrap those 2 social histories around the subject and the project by making photographs in those 2 spaces. So I spent several months in Birmingham photographing young people and adults who were the same ages. It was a very intensive project because I didn't want to just photograph young people and adults. I wanted them to be that age. I wanted them to be 13 or 16 or 66 and 63. For me, that's what really made it resonate, that they were not just young and older, but they were the ages of these people that we lost, those young African Americans that we lost.
I think that the power of them is that, as portraits, they're so immediate. But then when we think about the conceptual relationship between them, we're also grasping kind of the arc of a life not lived. And so it's that combination for me of the sort of immediacy of their physical presence, and then the empathetic imagination that I have to do to kind of comprehend the larger history that I think makes them so incredibly moving. I want to start wrapping up now, because I know some people probably have questions and dinner, but we have sort of 4 bodies of work.
Another thing I want to say about this work,
Mhm.
the previous project is made in color. This work is made in black and white because I wanted, through the use of black and white material, to suggest the past in the present moment, to use the material of photography as a way to allude to that history as well.
Well, that leads actually to sort of this next body of work, which is all in color, and it's very much about the present. And that is that, in 2014, you started photographing again in Harlem after, for almost 40 years absence. And I say absence because to me, these pictures really are about absence. They're about a kind of absence of community. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about sort of the impetus for making pictures of Harlem, which, at this moment is undergoing incredible gentrification, transformation, and, sort of subject to larger forces of kind of global capitalism, and urban change. And one thing that really struck me across all these pictures is, their absence of human presence, except maybe as kind of symbolized here in the poster with the hairstyles. But they're also really almost about not being able to see, right? This is, literalized here in no entry, no access here. There's, this is a great picture. It's kind of a facade, poster for a new fancy development with, kind of graffiti across it. But also that term lust to me, which speaks too about kind of avarice and greed and capital. So if you tell us a little bit about, this series before we kind of close up on the last series in the exhibition, because it seems to me it's very different, obviously from your earlier work in Harlem.
Yeah, I wanted to make work about the way in which the landscape of Harlem was being transformed, the way space was being transformed, the way a kind of space memory was being lost in Harlem for those who had lived there for a long time, for the residents of Harlem, and how the landscape was being transformed through the forces of gentrification and the influx of global capital into this community. It's the first group of photographs that I made in which the portrait isn't central to the work, because I wanted to make work about the landscape, about place. I didn't want to make, contemporary portraits of Harlem. I really wanted to talk about the place, the way the environment was being reshaped. And so I wanted to conceptually and formally find a vocabulary through which I could talk about that. And again, they're large scale in their color, because this is happening now. Unlike the Birmingham work, which alludes to the past, this is a very contemporary set of circumstances. So, given my long history in Harlem, and I've never stopped visiting Harlem, and Harlem has undergone several waves of gentrification, I wanted to insert myself into that narrative and find a way to make work to talk about that, to visualize that, to give that transformation that's going on some kind of resonant form in my photograph.
I think too, what's interesting to me is you complete the Birmingham work, which really is kind of as you said, your first thinking about a discrete historical moment, but also the traces in the present. In the Harlem work, you're looking at the present and and seeing kind of the loss of the past. And that brings me to your most recent body of work, finished work, and what closes out the show. And arguably, for a lot of people, seems like so different from a lot of what we have seen tonight. And also really one of the most beautiful and kind of powerful bodies of work you've done, Night Coming Tenderly Black. And for viewers who don't know this body of work, it's a kind of empathetic reimagining of the pathway of a fugitive enslaved person making their way north in Ohio in search of freedom, kind of along the Underground Railroad. And I wanted to ask you, as we go through these pictures, about the impetus for the work, but also especially about the title, which of course comes from a Langston Hughes poem, about the emphasis on the word Black and on the concept of an affirmative Blackness in this and across your work, and then also on the materiality of Black in these pictures, which are so, I mean, this is really why everybody who is in Atlanta needs to come see the show. They're so alluring and materially rich and silvery. Screen can't possibly capture it. So if you could tell us a little bit about, how this body of work came about and how you see it as part of the larger sweep of your concerns as an artist.
Well, this work conceptually follows the Birmingham Project to find a way to speak about and visualize the past and the contemporary moment, and to make something that is clearly made in the contemporary moment, but really resonates strongly with an aspect of the past when one engages with it. So this is part of what has become an ongoing history project that I'm working on. The work came out of being invited to make work for the Front Triennial in Cleveland, Ohio. They wanted me to make some work for the Triennial, and I told them I would be interested if I could continue working on the history project that I was working on, because I don't like, once I get an idea, I don't like to be sidetracked. I want to keep digging deeply into that area. And I started doing research about Cleveland and quickly found that Cleveland and Northeastern Ohio, because of its proximity to Lake Erie, was a very important piece of the history of the Underground Railroad. And so the Underground Railroad became the narrative anchor for this work that I wanted to make. And doing research about the Underground Railroad quickly revealed that the Underground Railroad is as much myth as it is fact, partly of necessity. The exact movement and location of fugitive enslaved people through the landscape could never be known. There was no way to track that with any precision. And even some of what they called the Underground Railroad stations, while a few of them are known, and people always put quotes around known when they say that, the history is one that is shrouded in a lot of myth, which gave me the freedom actually to make my work in that area. And what I wanted to do was to make work that reimagine the path of self-liberation through the landscape, moving toward Lake Erie in Cleveland and Northeastern Ohio. The photographs are made in Hudson, Ohio. John Brown and his sons had homes in Hudson, Ohio. There were a number of abolitionists in Northeastern Ohio in Hudson. So I kind of used what information I had that was the anchor to the work. John Brown's tannery, we still know what the site of that is. And then, Kozak Bates' house, which sits right in the middle of Cleveland. You know, that's another known location. So I anchored the project to those known locations and then started exploring the landscape around those locations, imagining, trying to almost channel the movement of a fugitive enslaved person through that landscape under cover of darkness. The material aspect of the photograph came both out of Langston Hughes' poem, Dream Variations. The last couplet is night coming tenderly, black like me. And this idea of that blackness being tender. So I started to think about, you know, the black subject in this tender embrace of night, moving through and coming out of the blackness of the space. And of course, when you say that in photography, you're talking about Roy de Carava.
Yeah.
I quickly came to Roy de Carava through thinking about the blackness of the subject, moving through the blackness of the landscape and the blackness of the photographic print itself. And for those of you watching who may not know de Carava's photograph, there are some of them very lush, deep black, deep gray photographs that are inhabited by these black subjects who are either inhabiting that space or coming out of that space. And they're really beautiful. It's a blackness that's not intimidating. It's a blackness like Langston Hughes blackness. It's a tender blackness. And so that became the material anchor of the work. So the photographs, which are not made at nighttime, but they're printed very much in the spirit of Roy de Carava's photographs, which are these very beautiful, dark, rich, almost black prints. And trust me, you're gonna have to go to the exhibition and see these, because what I'm talking about is not what you're seeing on this screen right now. You're gonna have to go and see them. They're very large scale because I want the person standing in front of them to almost be able to immerse or lose themselves in the landscape, to have to look into the darkness in a way that begins to resemble that experience as your eyes move through that darkness of space. Your body is kind of following. So that's what this work is about. It's anchored to Langston Hughes' poem, and it's materially anchored to Roy de Carava's idea about blackness in photography, a material blackness. The blackness is not just black, it's a narrative blackness, it's a material blackness. It's a black is beautiful blackness.
Well, they are incredibly beautiful. I think of the blackness as like a blanket, you know, that you put on, and you know, it's comforting. And the pictures really do take you on a journey. I mean, you take us through these spaces. And the last picture in the show is also where we're going to end and maybe open up for a few questions. But I thought that, you know, it was sort of you go through this journey and you see houses and fences and maybe swamp-like forests. And then you finally get to the end, which is the edge of Lake Erie, across which, of course, is Canada and the symbol of freedom and liberation. But to me, this picture is also incredibly ambivalent because there's still yet another leap to go, and there's no clear way of getting there. And I thought it was also kind of a metaphor for, you know, where we are in American culture. Like, a certain journey has been made, and yet there's still a great unknown and a great sense of kind of risk and ambiguity, you know, kind of towards liberation. So to me, that the show ends on such a kind of emotionally resonant moment, particularly now for these times. So I want to thank you for sharing this work with us. I hope that everybody comes to see it. I know it's late, but we have a couple questions. If you're still willing to entertain some, Dawoud, maybe I'll ask you a few, and then we can sign off for evening. Does that sound good? Shall we take a few questions, Dawoud? Are you up for some questions?
Oh, absolutely.
I thought you would be, because you're such a generous photographer. So I will go in no particular order, but we have a young person, possibly a photographer. What advice would you give to developing artists interested in photography or visual cultural preservation in general? So your advice to a young artist or an aspiring artist. Would you like me to repeat the question, Dawoud? I'm not sure if you're, let's see. We have a question about what advice you would give to a young artist.
What advice would I give to a young artist? Well, I'm certainly curious how young is young, but I think in general, I would encourage any young artist to make work about things that you care about. And that can be anything. You know, the work has to be led by a passion. That can be a passion for a subject. It can be a passion for a way of thinking about art making. It can be a passion for material. Like it just has to be driven by a passion and a desire to bring something into the world that you know is a reflection of your passion, but that can also help the person standing in front of it feel more impassioned, present in the world, and alive and engaged through your work. But that can be anything. You know, the work that I look at, I love everything from, I can't even begin to tell you. A lot of painters I look at that I love. I love Sol LeWitt. I love Bryce Martin. Uh, you know, a lot of contemporary artists, younger contemporary artists. But the thing I love about the work is that it's driven by a passion to dig deeply into an idea or a particular narrative. I could sit here and give you examples of the kind of work that I find engaging. Those are just two random ones off the top of my head.
Yeah, we have a related question.
But also to form a community around your work.
Yeah, I think that relates to another question, which is similar. It's from a founder of a nonprofit who brings photo education to teens and to underserved communities. And she asks about any advice on working with young people to engage them in photography, and especially to give them a sense of autonomy in their work.
Well, I think any way in which you can engage young people and help them to feel both more seen in the world, for their presence to be acknowledged, and to kind of bring them into a conversation about art making that we don't always think of including them in, and how art making can help them to be present in the world. However you can find to do that, under whatever structure you can make that happen, or whatever structure you can create to make that happen.
I think
it's important because I think, you know, one of the things that working on class pictures for several years reminded me that young people have stories that no one ever asked them about, and my, coming into their lives through my work gave them a place to be present in the world, and also gave me a place to continue my own practice. So I think, one has to believe in the value of that work, that we all were young people at one time, and to, not forget that fundamental fact, and to realize that young people are capable of being complexly engaged in ways that we don't often give them credit for.
Well, on that note of hope for the future and the potential for really the emerging generation, which I agree with you, I think, transforming the world. I really want to thank you for your time tonight. It's 7:34, and I know that we've begged your indulgence greatly, but it's been such a pleasure kind of having this conversation with you and working with you, but especially to share your art with our Atlanta audiences. So I want to thank you all and thank everybody at home, wherever you are, plugged into your computers, for spending the evening with us. I encourage you to see the exhibition. If you're not in Atlanta, but you are near New York, you're in luck, because it will be traveling to the Whitney Museum in the spring. And I hear rumors of further venues for the exhibition, but I don't think they're official yet. So I'll just say stay tuned. And Dawoud, I hope that if things work out, we'll also be able to welcome you in person in Atlanta this spring before the show closes. If so, we'll find another way to bring some audiences to hear you speak, but we'll have to see about that. So.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank all of you who have joined us for this Zoom conversation. The final thing I would say, given the moment that we're in, that Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was the minister of Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, he always said, "Keep the faith, baby." So I'm asking all of you, I'm inviting you to keep the faith. I'm going to have my eyes on those numbers tonight, and hopefully Georgia's going to pull us through. We'll see how it goes, but keep the faith. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep, it's not over. We have each other. We have our work. So everyone take care.
Thank you, Dawoud, and thank you for that really powerful closing message. And thank you to all of our listeners tonight. Sign off. Okay. Get some sleep, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for putting this together, Sarah. Take care.
Thank you, Dawoud. Take care.